I'm going to show you how to run an EMG biofeedback session. So that's muscle tension biofeedback using the Mind-Body Training Tools software. Now the starting point as ever is the icon for the platform program. This is the icon. Now if you haven't already installed the software, you need to do that now. I'm assuming in this video that you have, but if you haven't, there is a separate video showing you how to install and set up that software. But assuming you have, let's start the platform program. Here it is. Now, as I've said before, there are a sequence of buttons down the left-hand side, one for each biofeedback modality. So we're going to be using the EMG for muscle tension tab. So I've clicked on that and I get these a sequence of buttons. I'll say more about that in a minute, but before I do, I want to go back to the setup tab here just to mention one thing that I've already mentioned in a previous video about device setup. So there's this button, device setup. If I select that, I get a dialog. Now if I'm running a real biofeedback session, I need to make sure that I've selected the right device for EMG biofeedback. So combo box, I can select the device that I have. If you've rented, it's going to be a PhysioData GP8. So you would select that and then click OK and carry on with the session. But for now, for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with the simulator. And what that means is that instead of generating real data, the software is just going to use a pre-recorded session. So it will just play back a recorded session. But the software will look exactly the same in all other respects. So that's just convenient for me to demonstrate the software. So I'm going to leave that set on simulator, click OK. Now the software always remembers the device selection that you've made. So when you come to run an actual biofeedback session, you need to make sure that the GP8 is selected. Of course you can select the simulator as well if you want to familiarize yourself with the software, but when you actually run a session, select GP8. So that's all I'm going to mention to do with setup at this stage. Now I'm going to go back to the EMG tab here and I'm going to talk about the buttons that you see. So first thing to say is that there are two applications that work with EMG. The second one here is called the EMG and breathing application. I'm not going to say anything more about that in this video. That's covered in further on in the course. I'm going to talk about the EMG, the basic EMG application. So there are three buttons. The first one, this one, launches the biofeedback application. And I'll do that in a minute. I'll just say something about the other buttons that you see on the screen. The next button generates a session report. So this you can use after your biofeedback session. And again, I'll say something more about session reports in a later part of this video. The third button here is very similar to the second button. It will generate a report, but this time for all the sessions that you've run. Again, I'll say something more about that later on. Now you can, if you want, there is a user guide for the application that goes through all the functions that you have in the application, just as I'm going to do in this video, but the user guide will give you more detail. And if you prefer to read about things, then that could be a better option. Okay, last thing to mention here, we've got one more button, which is to check the battery. So if you're using a GP8 which runs on batteries, not all of them do. The later versions of the GP8 don't have batteries, but if you have a device that does have batteries, then you can use that to check the status of the batteries. I would only use that if you've got a problem, if the GP8 doesn't appear to be working as you would expect. Otherwise, don't worry about that. The first place to start is by launching the application using this button. Okay, let's launch the basic EMG application. So just again, I'm in the platform program and I'm on the EMG tab, that's here, and then to launch the basic EMG application, I click this button. So I've clicked that once. Now here I get a reminder I'm in simulator mode. That's to make sure that you know that you're not reading live data. So that's okay for now because I'm just demonstrating the software, but you won't get that when you're running a live session with a real device. So I'm going to click yes to actually start the application. Now at this point another program starts. It's called BioEra, which is a third-party product that I used to develop the particular applications of the biofeedback suite. So here it is. This is the interface for the basic EMG application. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is press the play button in the top left corner. Now, this is a feature of all the applications in the suite. They all have these buttons. They are play, stop, and pause, and then there's a session time. So I'm going to press play once now, and the session time starts to run. Now, at that point, something happens on the screen here. I've got a signal. Now, at the moment, it's gone off the top, but that will settle down within a few seconds. I just want to mention one more thing at this point. That's in the top right corner. Now, normally, if you're using a real device, you'll have a little sort of LED or a simulated LED that will turn from red to green when you press the play button. So if it goes green, everything's working. If it doesn't go green, it means that something's gone wrong. The software hasn't found the device or something, or it's, there's some other problem. But that should happen if everything's working. So if it doesn't turn green, go back and check what's going wrong. Okay, in my case, I'm just using the simulator, so there's nothing can go wrong. It's just replaying a recorded file. Okay, let me give an overview of what you're seeing in the charts here. So we've got a number of charts. There are three major ones. The top one, covering more or less half the screen, is the short-term display of the muscle tension parameter. Now you can see this trace, and it's going up and down. It goes up when you tighten up, and then when you relax, it goes back down again. That's essentially what it means. So obviously the training is going to be about learning to bring the signal down as low as possible. Now we'll get on to how you can do that in subsequent parts of this module. But this video is just about showing you how to use the software. So we're not going to worry about that right now. And when you run your first session, you shouldn't worry too much either. Just get used to the software. That's all I would say. Just play with it. Just experiment. Okay, but I will say that we've got a numeric scale here. By default, it goes from 0 to 12. Now, using the wrist placement, which means that you're measuring all the muscles in the arms and hands and shoulders. Now, using that placement, then fully relaxed, it's possible to get that down to about 1 on this scale. Yeah, so that would be about as low or as relaxed as you can get. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now. But essentially, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this short-term display. That's the main one. We've also got this associated sort of bar graph, which is just showing the same thing. So this is the present tension. The bar graph goes up and down with this signal here, so you can see how they go together. So it's just really part of one single display. That's how I think of it. Now, you've also got this dotted yellow line going halfway up the scale. It's currently at 6. Now, that's something called the threshold. At this stage, it's not really relevant. What I will say is that you can adjust it by dragging this bar with your mouse, as I've just done. So I'm just going to put it down there at the bottom of the screen. At this point, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make any difference to what we're doing. It's relevant especially to audio feedback, which we cover in a later video later on in the course. So I'm not going to say anything more about the threshold for now, but one way that you could use it is to set a sort of target for yourself. So if you want to get below 1.5, you can see the target there for you. So that's the short-term display. Now we've got two more sort of major displays in the software, so I'll just mention them. Now this next one down is the long-term display. It's really showing exactly the same thing as the short-term display, which is the muscle tension measurement. And again, the higher the trace goes in the chart, the more tense you are, and then you can relax and it will come down lower. So it just takes longer to get right the way across. So you can see more of your session in that chart. That's the only difference. It takes about 10 minutes to get across. You can actually change that 10-minute session. I'll say something more about that in the later section of this video. For now, I'm just giving an overview of what you see in the basic EMG application. So there's one more chart, which is this bottom one. Now I'm going to say very little about this because it's hardly relevant at all. It's really just sort of complicating things too much to really talk about what it means. So I would, for most people, you can safely just ignore that display. I will just say a little bit for those people that are interested. It's what it is. It's a spectral analysis display. Now that's based on the idea that the raw measurement of EMG is not quite like it is as you see here, but it's actually a rapidly oscillating signal. So it's going up and down very, very rapidly, and the frequency of the oscillations is constantly changing. Or another way to say that is that the frequency, there's not just one frequency, but there's a whole mixture of frequencies of oscillation, all wrapped up together in the same signal. And what this display does, this spectral analysis, is it breaks the signal into the component frequencies. That's what it does. So we've got, this bottom graph, this bottom axis shows the frequency, and yeah, that's all I'm going to say, except to say that what we're measuring here is based on the region between 100 and 200 Hertz. That's all I'm going to say about that. But like I say, the main thing is that for most people that's just not of interest, so you might as well just ignore that. It's just, in some ways, it's just overcomplicating things by going into it. But there it is. It's in the software. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for this section of the video. I'm going to, in the next section, I'm going to explain how to fine-tune the displays, but I'll come back to that. For now, I'm just going to say that when you've finished your session, you can press the stop button and it will stop the flow of data, and then the cross in the corner to close the session down, and then you can, well, depending on the options that you've set, you can save the data. I'll save that. Doing that allows me to generate a session report, which again I'm going to talk about in a later section of this video. I'm going to show you how to adjust the display settings in the software so that you can fine-tune the visual feedback to best meet your needs. So here we are, the basic EMG application again, and I'm going to press play in the top left corner there, and that starts the flow of data. So here's the trace appeared. Let's start by talking about the short-term display, which is the main one. Now you can see immediately that at the moment the signal is off the screen. Now if I wanted to sort of zoom out to see more of the signal, then I can do that using this control here. It's a combo box control, and it sets the vertical scale on the short-term display. So at the moment by default it's 0 to 12, and if I want to sort of zoom back, I can change it to something bigger, say 0 to 20. So you can see that when I did that, the signal sort of dropped down a level because I've got a wider scale. I've now got 0 to 20. Of course, I can go back in the other way. I can zoom in, as it were. So if I change it to, say, 4 microvolts, as it is, now I've got a much more detailed view of the signal. So we've got a smaller scale, 0 to 4 this time, and that's going to be relevant as you learn to relax better and become more sensitive to the fine nuances of the muscle tension measurement. So that's going to be a very useful control, and perhaps even the only one that you might want to use, but there are some other ones that I'll just tell you about for completeness. The next one is this one. It's another combo box control. It's called the period, and it controls the horizontal scale of the short-term display, or the time scale. So by default it's 1 minute, it's 0 to 60 seconds, and I can change it to something longer or shorter just as I wish. I'm not going to do that, but you get the basic idea. So those are the two controls for the short-term display. Now there's an equivalent 2 controls for this display. The next one down, it's the long-term display. So let's start with the time scale again, the long-term period, the horizontal or time scale. By default it's 10 minutes. I could change it to something shorter or longer. just to suit my needs depending on how long my session is, for example. I can also change the vertical scale using this control. Again, it's called range. By default it's 0 to 12. I could change that to something higher or lower. Okay, now those are the main controls that you probably want to use. Now there are lots of other controls, so I'll just say something briefly about them now. In the bottom right corner of the screen here, I've got several controls that are to do with audio feedback. Now I'm going to postpone talking about these until a later part of the module, so that's going to be another video, a separate video, where I talk about audio feedback and how that's used. There are one or two other controls, such as the epoch control here, that are really advanced user controls that you'll probably never want to use. So most people can quite happily ignore those controls, but just for completeness I'll say something about them in a later section. Let's look at the report functions that the software has. So here we are in the platform application, and we're on the EMG tab again. This is the button we use to launch the application, and then the next one down allows us to generate a report of the session. So if you've just run a biofeedback session and you want to review the session as a whole, then you can generate a report using this function. So I'm going to try that now. I'm clicking this second button down. Now the first thing that happens is that a dialog box comes up offering me to select a session. So because this is a fairly new installation, I've only got 2 sessions there, so I'm just going to go with that default one. I'll select OK, and then another dialog comes up. So this time it's options for the report. Now I'm not going to say much about these because I want to keep things simple. To be honest, session reports for EMG really aren't that useful. They're not that interesting. The more interesting session reports come in the later modules, notably for the capnometry and for the HRV. So I'm not going to say too much at this stage. I will just mention one of the options is that I can add notes to the report. So if I check that option and then click the OK button, the first thing that happens is that another dialog comes up where I can type in my report, my notes for the session. Then I click OK when I'm done, and then up comes the report. Now you might notice that the report is shown in a browser, in an internet browser. So in this case it's Google Chrome. The software has generated the report as an HTML document. That doesn't mean it's on the internet. It's just a file on your computer, but we're using the browser to view that file. So here it is. It's very simple. In the case of the EMG application, there really isn't much data to generate. There's only the EMG signal itself. So we've just got one chart. And in this session, it was quite a short session. You can see it only lasted a total of 80 seconds. That was just to keep things fairly simple. We've got a summary table telling us that the maximum and minimum for the EMG parameter. And there's my notes that I typed. Obviously nonsense there, but that's not really the point. This is just for demonstration purposes. That's essentially it. As I say, the session report is not really very interesting for EMG. So there it is. So I'll close that down. Now the next function is that you can generate an application report. I'm not going to do this right now because again it's just not very interesting for the EMG application. But the application report allows you to see your progress over all your sessions. So imagine you do a session every day for 2 weeks. You can see the progress that you made in that time by clicking on that function. Now I'm going to go into much more detail into application reports in later modules, especially in the HRV one, where it's much more interesting to look at progress. But that's all I'm going to say for now in the EMG module. I'll conclude by saying something about the advanced user controls that are in the application. So these are really not very relevant. For most people, you could quite happily stop the video now. You don't really need to know about these things. You could quite happily just ignore these functions, but just for completeness, I'll say something about them. There are 3 of them, and the first one is this epoch combo box control at the top. Now what this does, it's an option to set how often the software writes a line of data to the session data file. So it will affect how fine-grained the data is in your session report. So that's all it does. So the options are 2. It's 2 seconds by default. Every 2 seconds it will write a summary line into the data file. So that's the epoch control. The next one is down here. It's the average control. It's another combo box. Now what this means is when the EMG signal is calculated, there's a certain degree of smoothing, if you like, or averaging. So by default, the average is set to 2 seconds. So what you see at any point in time is 2 seconds worth of data averaged out, so that the variation is relatively smooth. Now if I change it to the smallest setting, you can see how the signal immediately becomes much more variable, much more noisy, you could say. So that's there as a possible control. Again, I wouldn't particularly advise using it. I think it's better just to have something fairly smooth and sensible, like 2 seconds. Okay, the last control, the last advanced user control, is the filter session. So it's this combo box control here. This is somewhat arcane, so I'll try and briefly explain what this is doing. So the raw EMG signal on which this calculation is based is actually a very rapidly oscillating signal. I mentioned this in an earlier video when I talked about the spectral analysis display, which is here. So the oscillating EMG signal has, you can think of that as lots of different frequency oscillations all mixed up together, yeah? And with the software, you can analyze that back into component frequencies. Now, the basic measurement that we're using in the short-term display and so on is based on a frequency range of 100 to 200. So that's the orange part of the graph here. If that doesn't make any sense to you, just don't worry about it, forget about it. You don't really need to know. Just leave this setting on 100 to 200 and never think of it again. But there is another option which is a much wider range. Now, I'd quite strongly advise against using that unless you really know what you're doing. Much better just to stick to 100 to 200 and don't worry about the effect that it has. So those are the 3 advanced user settings. The only other controls that I haven't mentioned are these ones across here, which are to do with the threshold. That's part of audio feedback, which I'm going to cover in a later video, as I've said before. These controls in the bottom right, as I said again earlier, they're to do with audio feedback as well, so they'll be covered in that later video.